It's a great pleasure to welcome you here. This is going to be, theory boot camp for 2 weeks or something like that. As I say, this is the fifth that we've organized, so we have a pretty good sense of the rhythms and the challenges that is involved in running these things. We'll turn to housekeeping in just a minute. Because there are a series of things that I'm sure you want to know that we need to let you know. But first, let me just say that these summer institutes are designed in order to address in a pretty intensive way. I mean, it's two weeks of intensive interaction, morning, noon, and night, around obviously a pre-selected thematic, in this case on creative societies, cultural industries, and the question of the humanities. Sorry, I'm getting some feedback off this thing. The point is to bring people together into a set of conversations that are not just from the podium to the audience, but is much more collaborative and interactive than that. So we'll be arranging breakout sessions, fora for engagements, not just between you and the presenters or instructors or whatever we call each other, but amongst yourselves as well. That said, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce a number of people who will be co-orchestrating events of the next couple of weeks. Toby Miller, my good friend and colleague from UC Riverside. If you don't know Toby, you will soon, right? Toby and I have been engaged in a conversation about this year's Summer Institute for probably a year now, almost a year, as part of a much longer conversation around issues of cultural studies, media studies, urban studies, and the like. Toby has been largely instrumental in being able to pull this all together for this year in his inimitable way. So it's a great pleasure to have worked this closely with him over this past year as a follow-up to things we've done together in the past. Next to him is Kate Oakley from London, who has come all the way to join us for these 2 weeks. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Andrew Ross, with his mouth full. But it's perfectly timed, so they can't say anything back. George Udacy, who's embedded in his computer. And Richard Maxwell, who's sitting over there in the corner. Lisa, where's Lisa? Hi, Lisa from UC Santa Barbara has driven down the 405 to join us, and we'll be here for a few days as well. And others, of course, will be coming in the interim. Before I turn over to housekeeping issues and then further introductions before getting going, I just want to extend a note of huge appreciation to the staff of UCHRI, without whom the Institute, without whom not only would this not be happening, but without whom the Institute really would not run at all.
Being a kind of spokesperson for this sort of phenomenon. So I feel, I suppose, I need to give a quick kind of account of some of the things that we talked about in that piece of work and some of the issues that I think continue to kind of haunt the debate about and the terminology. The confusion in the terminology is an indication of the confusion in the thinking in this area. But the cultural industries, the creative society, the creative economy, all of those terms, all of the above, in a sense. And you'll notice I use those terms almost interchangeably, or you'll notice that over the next couple of weeks. And there are entire books and huge amounts of debate devoted to the difference between these kind of things. But I use them interchangeably in a kind of pragmatic way because I think it all refers to a similar kind of phenomenon. I think the differences are important, but I also think there's a kind of similar thing that these terms are getting at, and so that's why I'll sort of use them interchangeably. But two reasons why I was interested in doing this original piece of work. The first one is that I am interested in how places develop sustainable economies, in a sense. How do places, the whole sort of cultural industries development in the UK was born out of a moment of fairly rapid and in many cases very painful deindustrialization of cities and places. Places were facing large, high unemployment, growth in poverty, growth in inequality, which obviously continues to this day, but serious kind of economic restructuring problems. And these industries were, for good or bad, seen as a way in which places could develop a sustainable economic base within the world, as it were. So I'm kind of interested in how you do that. I'm interested in how you do sustainable economic development. And I've been trying to do it for sort of, 15 years now, and I don't know how you do it, basically. But I'm still interested in the problem of it. And the second reason that I wanted to do it when someone says, you've got an English degree, you know about culture, was because, I am a big sort of cultural consumer. I've measured out my life to some degree by the books that I've read and the movies that I've seen and the music that I've listened to. And therefore, although I try to take a kind of critical and dispassionate to some degree perspective on these kind of things, I am also a fan. So I kind of like things. I kind of like initiatives. I don't mind. I'm not, resistant to the fact that we promote the production of culture, in a sense, as a kind of policy objective. I don't have a problem with that notion. The way in which it's done, who gets to produce it, who gets to consume it, under what conditions, I think matter hugely. But the notion itself of having policy for the production of culture, of places focusing to a greater degree on cultural activities, I don't find a kind of offensive idea. I'm sort of, broadly sympathetic to it because I like the stuff that comes out of it, and the stuff that I don't like, fine. So there were, I think, probably 4, maybe 3. I've written them down over there, but I'll probably forget them standing up here. But there are probably 3 or 4 themes in that original work which I think do tend to kind of haunt this debate somewhat. The first one is that it's always been, I think, very kind of, the debate about sort of creative industries and place I'm talking about now, optimistic to kind of boosterish. There's a sense in which the debate was born out of the desire to do something, or the policy initiatives born out of the desire to do something in a deindustrializing, as I said, situation. And this was seen as a positive, it was seen as a progressive, at the time, move to develop interesting, sustainable work which would enable places to some degree, parlay the distinctive advantages, which are seen as being cultural, in a kind of sort of global economy. I think the evidence, which is kind of accrued over the last kind of 10 years about the degrees to which these kind of economic developments are sustainable or do develop that kind of progressive agenda, is generally speaking doesn't lend itself to optimism. But the boosterism has somehow never gone away, and in fact it's kind of inversely related to the kind of empirical evidence for some reason, whether these things. So the more that you know that most of these jobs that the cultural industries create are either occupied by poorer people in the global south or by university-educated middle-class people in the global north, the more you know that, the more you will hear people telling you how they offer opportunities to kind of marginalised groups, and they're a way forward for all sorts of people to get involved in. So I think there's a kind of boosterism. I think there's a focus on, certainly in the UK, initially, on the small, the individual, the entrepreneurial, the changing ways in which work is organised. And that makes this debate about sort of cultural industries and creative industries, in a sense, somewhat at odds and somewhat out of sync with what we actually understand about the big cultural industries, which are the media industries. So I think there's always been a problem in kind of policy terms in that cultural industry policies, creative industry policies tend to focus on things which are not the media for some reason, things which are not big kind of vertically integrated industries. And they're always often about small businesses, entrepreneurship, individuals. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it's very hard to make it work, and it's very hard to make it deliver sort of large numbers of jobs. I'm just going to look at my pad now for the fourth point that I did want to make on this. Oh yeah, the one about location. As I say, I think the policy, the drivers behind this, in a sense, were about how can places reinvent, reimagine themselves in this kind of globalizing world and in this kind of deindustrialized, post-industrial sort of economy. And I think that, again, the evidence on the degree to which places can become sustainable is also not great. If you look at the kind of geography, the economic geography of these kind of sectors, it doesn't also lead to a sort of optimism. So, why do I continue to do this? I suppose it's a good question. other than the need to earn a living, Toby, which I'm sure I could find something else to do if I had to. But I think that I remain interested in the two things that I started off being interested in. I'm interested in the conditions under which people produce culture, the kind of culture that gets produced, and I'm increasingly interested in cultural workers. I've spent the last year talking to, doing some deep sort of biographical interviews with artists, for example, 40 biographical interviews with fine artists. So I'm interested in how cultural workers work and in the organisation of work in those sectors. And I think I can retain some kind of optimism about the potential that cultural activities, cultural economic development, the arts, for want of a very old-fashioned term, offer to people for, if not sustainable economic development, then ways of kind of self-realization, I suppose. That's a sort of idealistic way of putting it, but I can't think of a better way of putting it. I think I remain optimistic that there is a potential, if these things are done well, done critically, done sensitively, done in light of the evidence that we now have about how to do them, that they can offer some good work for some people. That's a very small thing to want to do in the world, believe me, I know. But I don't, one of the problems about this whole area is it's loaded with expectations about the social problems that it can solve, and I'm generally hugely skeptical about this. But I believe that developing cultural industries can offer some good work to some people. That's probably pretty much it. And at that point, I'll stop.
Okay, thanks, Kate. So what we're going to do now is, after I give my little burst on the history of the world, which normally takes me about 10 minutes, we're going to open the floor for a plenary discussion based on the questions, issues, conflicts that arise there. We'll form a number of groups which are called, in the horrible world of conference speech, breakouts. Sorry, it's very hard to avoid cliches when you're adopting these Olympian yet managerialist perspectives. And into those breakout groups, everybody will go and have a chat amongst yourselves, nominate a rapporteur, come back to us, and then all of us will benefit from what you've had to say based on your thoughts about the seminar, what David said, what Kate said, what David and Kate didn't say, whatever it may be. And that will be a kind of model for how we'll proceed for the rest of the seminar. The attempt to have persons get up and talk so you have some content, opportunities for you to say straight away in kind of primary process, I think this. But if you're not a primary process person and you're more of a small group person, you'll have a chance to do that too, and then come back to us and share those, okay? So I want to take us back to the late 1950s, a decade of great importance to many of the grey-haired people in this room, and to C.P. Snow, who was a novelist. He was the person who invented the phrase, the corridors of power, to describe the physical lobbies in the House of Commons in Britain, where deals were done between lobbyists for industrialists and politicians. He wrote a series of novels about that idea. But he was also a very eminent physicist. And one of the things that he found difficult to resolve was what he saw as the two halves of himself. And he called them, in the end, two cultures. The part that was to do with being a humanities person, a creative person, a novelist, and the part to do with being a physicist. And he thought that these two cultures, as he called them in a best-selling pamphlet of 1957 rather than 1997, the first culture was that of the past It was essentially an archival culture, just the kind that David was alluding to when he talked about the beginnings of the recuperative archival project of the humanities and technology. And this was what was the humanities. And it was the same if he was in Greenwich Village. It was the same if he was at MIT. It was the same if he was in South Kensington. It was the same if he was anywhere in Western Europe that he went. Namely, people looking back at the past to try to hold on to something they thought they'd lost, and engaging in textual interpretation to try to do it. As opposed to what he saw as the culture of the future, which was reshaping and changing, transforming things, which was what physicists were doing. And when David talked about the 2 minutes of fame that philosophers had with Saul Kripke, physicists had about 10 to 15 years of incredible fame when they were going to change the world. And if anybody wants to know why there is currently a debate about the relationship between Iran and the United States over atomic energy, it's to do with the 15 years of fame that US physicists had, because of course Iran got atomic energy and technology from the Eisenhower administration as part of Atoms for Peace, which was an international policy initiative where the United States thought that if it gave non-Marxist-Leninist regimes access to nuclear technology, they would remain friendly to US imperialism. So as part of that 15 years of fame that physicists had, they were going to be the future. This drew a kind of hysterical response from F.R. Leavis, amongst others, the Leavisite scion that Kate referred to, denouncing this technological futurist position and so on. The pamphlet went on to be reprinted probably dozens of times. It's still in print 50 years later. And it continues to be one of the key ways in which you divide the campus.
Don't remind me of the question again. It was whether there is kind of coherence in these kind of things. Is that essentially...
Not so much whether there is or isn't. I mean, I'm sure that there isn't.
Occasionally. If you're in Sweden, there is.
So I guess I'm interested in the ways in which when there's friction or incongruencies and what happens in those circumstances. If we could give some examples to think through.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that's important to note, and again, I sort of apologize that most of my experience of these things is in European countries, and often in kind of European countries that have a much more sort of dirigiste kind of policy interventionist way of operating than a federal sort of system like the US. So I think, to be honest, that probably in dirigiste European political entities, it's easier to get that kind of coherence than it is in more federal, more sort of decentralized, more deregulated kind of political systems. But it is true that there's also, a degree of sort of ignorance often, or lack of understanding on the part of people who are actually trying to carry these things out. I've been in lots of meetings in relatively small places where somebody's trying to do a cultural industries strategy for East Anglia, which is part of the UK, on the east coast of UK. And people will say things like, we've got to do this about providing business advice for people, or we've got to set up workspace for people because they need access to workspace, or they need something about funding. No, what should we do about IP issues? To which the answer is there's nothing you can do about IP issues in East Anglia kind of thing. But there's often a kind of misunderstanding, I think, and a lack of knowledge about what you can do at what spatial level for these kind of things, which is problematic. And on that point, I mean, this is not really what you asked me, but it is sort of relevant to some of the things we've been talking about, is that it's not just me, in a sense, who's kind of autodidactic about this. One of the interesting things about policy enactment in this kind of area is that most of the people who are doing it are making it up as they go along. There's very little professional training for doing this kind of stuff, interestingly enough. And therefore, there is often possibly more confusion about what you can and can't do than there ought to be or there could be.
I want to make up one general comment without being immediately banished to the race and ethnicity breakup group. Okay?
It's arbitrary.
You've just created them.
Exactly. And the comment is, it's meant to be productive. Okay? It struck me how static the two first descriptions of the development of the humanities, on the one hand, and of issues of deindustrialization and the role of the creative industries that may or may not have in fixing the needs created by this deindustrialization. And it also struck me how much more dynamic in the sense of bringing real subjects into place Toby's presentation was, in the sense that, you know, the nation state makes an appearance, imperialism makes an appearance, so that it's not space as an agent, but it's actually the processes of industrialization that involve or do not involve other peoples, British or otherwise, immigrants or native. Because when, in the process that you're describing, what's happening is also that the face of England is changing under the pressure of immigration. In the genealogy of the humanities that you provided, it struck me how absent the nation state, which has centrally organized since the conquest of America, by which I mean the Americas, in the imperial powers and then in the national countries thus created, has been in the organization of the knowledge of the humanities and the productivity and usefulness or lack thereof of that knowledge. So as a general comment, what I wanted to point is how crucial it is if we push the scales and the scopes to be hopefully biospherical, global in that sense, systemic in that sense. Because what has changed, what for me the crisis of the humanities mean, is that we're one white, single, homogeneous, self-coinciding subject used to think of itself as such, as a subject. What has changed is that we have moved to a world where those territories of the nation, of the region, of the space, of the subject, of the self, go in crisis, because that subject discovers all of a sudden that he has been a colonialist subject and has been dependent for, like the Tempest, dependent on the productivity of others, on exploitation, on surplus value, on appropriation. And that is not, to use a padarized language here, it is not self-coincided, homogeneous geographies of traits that the humanities are supposed to map, both inside and outside the subject, socially and individually. But it's actually about processes, and it's about change, and it's about interactions between scales that are interdependent. So along those lines, and I believe that is why you were bringing in friction here, because friction is crucial to this kind of perspective. We've moved from a humanities that were in charge, as Toby said, of producing the cultural capital for the national imperial bourgeoisie, to a point where the humanities have to wonder what the heck is it that we are producing and for whom. Because most of the students we are actually dealing with are those who do not have enough economic capital to go into the hard sciences, and oftentimes are of color. And what are we preparing them for? For service? In what industry? And at what pay? And who is making the whole enterprise possible with physical work? So to cut it short, I know it's no longer short anymore, but basically I'm trying to say, if we bring in dynamics and processes and friction and interaction and codependence, we change the way in which we map both the history of the humanities in the US, the crisis of urban development in England, and the story of creative industries globally. And I take it that all of you are in that orientation, but I just wanted to emphasize how absent that interdependence and friction that in the genealogy of the humanities had been.
I'm curious, Toby, in your comments about the humanities, I don't recall exactly the statement, but you mentioned guns, and then you said, well, that's a part, or you seem to have separated guns from humanities. And my question is, don't guns have a part in humanities? And doesn't violence have a part in the humanities? Doesn't the whole, how would I say, criminal population and incarcerated population that we've created in this country, don't they have a part in the humanities? And the other question is, creative industries, it seems to be that they all seem to be positive as you're presenting them, but are they also negative? In other words, are creative industries involved in crime? And crime is one of the biggest, how would I say, producers of culture that we have in this particular country, that we have all over the world.
Yeah.
So why did you separate guns? I mean, what are you? Are you afraid of guns, or what's the thing? I'm just pulling you.
No.
But that's a serious question, though.
Alejandro, right? Alejandro, thanks for a great question. My response is twofold. A slight difference I was trying to draw between guns and the other things is that guns involve manufacturing. And in terms of export, which is what I was focusing on, they're one of the few manufacturers in the United States, militarism in general, military technology is one of the few manufacturers that is successfully exported. And the other manufacturers that are successfully exported include things like aerospace, much of which is underwritten by militarism. So that's why I was differentiating it.
I just see
yeah.
how you do it, because if you talk about manufacturing, well, guns manufacture films, and we export films. Guns manufacture, a whole gangs, and we export gangs.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There is a very important connection. And in fact, when you mention the prison population, a key element of that related to the creative industries is, of course, that we have a slavery population, namely the imprisoned population, that is the major domestic workforce for the United States in the disassembly of dangerous electronic devices. So electronic waste from televisions, computers, and so on, when it isn't exported to Mexico, to India, to China, and so on from the United States, to Kenya, to Ghana, to Nigeria, is exported to the US domestic prison system, where basically minority incarcerated people being paid between 23 cents and $1.15 an hour, working under unsafe conditions, disassemble these technologies in order that they can then be redisposed. So yes, the carceral is very important. Guns are important to culture. And in terms of creative industries all being, in a sense, a cakewalk and positive, I think they're multifaceted and complex and contradictory in just the way that Juan was suggesting. So I think I'm on side with you. I think I didn't express myself as clearly as I might have, which, as those of you who don't know me will come to see, is extremely rare indeed, but does occasionally.
Yeah, I want to spin off also about your comment, which I found quite interesting. With regards also to your comment regarding knowledge, what is it that we're producing here in this seminar? As Toby pointed out also in his talk, there's this lack of pragmatism, or might be a lack of pragmatism to this sort of discussion we're having here. So, I mean, I think circulation of knowledge is great and dandy, and I enjoy it as much as anybody else. But in terms of relevancy and the relevance of what kind of work we're producing here, and in quantifiable empirical terms, what are we producing, and in which ways can this become relevant outside this sort of, bourgeois elite milieu that we're all sharing, which is a sort of academia. So what does it do in layman's terms to the, retired coal miner or whoever it may, or their sons who work in museums as well? So this is sort of my area of inquiry here.
Okay, hi there. I have a question for Toby. And I kept thinking about what you said about how how a lot of academics don't think about how books are produced, and how a lot of media studies people don't think about the environmental impact of films and that sort of thing. And I mean, this is kind of a dumb question, but I wonder what your take is on why people are so out of touch. Is it to do with this willful ignorance? Is it to do with worry that the boundaries of the discipline are going to disappear? Or I mean, is it to do with trying to hang on to this belief that culture is inherently good, and culture in that very old-fashioned sense is inherently good, and doesn't to think that it actually causes any kind of damage is scandalous. So I'm just curious to hear your take on why people are so out of touch with these issues.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think it's all of the above. And I think Andrew's comment is also important here, that sometimes when you're in the heart of the empire, you don't know how the empire works and what it does. I also think that when we talk about the humanities, often, at least when I do, I slip into thinking that it means literary studies, whereas of course it means many other things as well, such as history and so on, although that is on the cusp of the social sciences. Philosophy wants to be a science, it's not even wanting to be a social science anymore, but a lot of these things are obviously very relevant. Sometimes it's because, particularly for those of us on the left, even those of us who've never read Hegel and don't want to, there is still something of German Romanticism impelling much of the humanities tradition. And of course that'll be very varied depending on, in terms of class relationships, what kind of educational system you're in. But nevertheless, there is something about the idea of bringing together the ethically incomplete subject that Hegel and Schiller and others are trying to compel us to do, that there's a thing called ethical substance, that it's been divided with the split between language and subjectivity, that it's been divided with the Industrial Revolution and the split of the kind that I was describing earlier between labour to make things and labour to discover and become who you are. And the idea that you could resolve that contradiction, that you could create an undivided ethical substance or focus on the divided ethical substance and love it, it's as important for those who are teaching Hamlet in terms of the doubting Dane and the impossibility of knowing precisely who you are, as it is for those teaching queer theory and the idea, in some ways deriving from Freud, another German romantic, of the irreducibility of contradiction in the getting of sexual subjectivity. So whether you claim you can resolve these contradictions or whether you want to celebrate them and make them bigger, there is this idea of divided ethical substance, of humanness, that tends to preoccupy people, particularly in textual traditions, whether they're Leaversites or they're Butlerites, and tends to get them off the hook from saying, who made the book?
Yeah, okay. I don't know if this is too specific. This would be more directed at Kate Oakley. I don't know if we're on a first name basis yet or not. But, anyways, so as far as the super cities versus the smaller cities, rural or the sort of neighborhood, the localizing or how you divide up the sort of from a policy standpoint, or also just from a general critical standpoint, how you begin to think about creative industries. I was just wondering if there is a distinction that's made in the work that you've done or in the discourse that you're familiar with as to the production of value at the local level, the circulation of that value in terms of cultural product. Because to a certain degree, of course, what we're talking about here is that creativity functions as a form of sort of innovation, which is the driver of, driver of profit, essentially, in a capitalist economy. But it seems to me that a lot of the sort of networks that this money circulates in are closed off to the more general market. So, for instance, the IPR in products that are owned in that system by larger conglomerates tends to locate in super cities, if we're speaking about it in terms of geography. But there are a lot of, it would seem to me, sort of sub-networks, let's say, that if we're making a technology comparison would be kind of hidden by the router or whatever, that money sort of gets choked off from and circulates in its own economy. And so, it's subcultures or whatnot, artist communities that tend to, or differently identified sort of cultural identities that might have that circulating in, and I know that to a certain degree that and some of the readings that we read that are sort of amorphous in my head at the moment, there's a lot of them. A lot of the localizing strategy, the sort of buy local strategy, can be at the one hand something that would do precisely that would isolate that circulation of value, whether it be mobile monetary value or specific product value within a given locality, or that can be sort of a niche marketing strategy for larger global players that have the capital to open up franchises, that sort of thing. Anyway, so basically if there are ways of talking about or specific issues that come up with how those sort of networks of value might be sort of partitioned off, and if that has, in your opinion, a positive or a negative within the value of policy, like a policy discussion level, let's say. That was really vague, I'm sorry.
No, it wasn't vague at all, actually. It was a great question. And I'm trying to think of a sort of clear answer. I think for most policymakers, it's not as well understood as it is in your head, basically. I think that was a clearer articulation than I've heard from most people who are actually trying to do these things. But I think, again, it sort of gets back to what part of the broad spectrum of the cultural industries are you talking about, and what are you trying to do? So that I think that there are a variety of strategies that are adopted. There are the very local ones, which is about how can we help artists who live in our neighbourhood to have cheap workspace and stay here, or how can we develop cultural tourism for Newport Beach or something like that, where the circulation of value is in sense is local kind of thing. And then there are the development of industries where the circulation of value is not local, and I think that's probably the area which is most difficult to do. It's very difficult. Hence, there are no film industries really outside of the US and India, that don't depend almost entirely on the state to support them, or at least depend in very large measure on the state to support them. So I think that's at the level of that kind of industry, it's very difficult. The third thing that you mentioned, and I think this is really interesting, is this point about the role of what we have to call creativity, really annoyingly, in broader innovation. And that's, I think, where lots of people think that the action is in terms of economic development. I think in the last 10 years, lots of places and lots of policymakers have thought, actually, doing this cultural industry stuff is really hard, because there's only a few places in the world going to have a genuine fine art market. And it seems to be difficult to do film industry without big state intervention. There are only a few places that are known, even for something like, popular music and TV. These kind of things are difficult to do in lots of cities and lots of locales. So the kind of default position now seems to be that doesn't really matter, because if we have lots of creative people about, all of our economy will be more innovative. There's a kind of, I wish I had it in front of me, but I got an extraordinary call about 2 years ago for a piece of work in the northeast of England. And they were looking for a creativity strategy for this part of no, actually it wasn't in the northeast of England. I tell a lie. I'm confusing two things. It was in back in East Anglia. It was in East Anglia in a place called Harwich, and they were looking for a creativity strategy which would improve innovation in the maritime and logistics sectors, because that's what they do in East Anglia. They don't make films or TV programs very much or music or anything like that. They do maritime and logistics, but they somehow got onto this idea that if they had a creativity strategy, if they had more artists presumably kind of hanging around in these towns, somehow, by some kind of weird process, this would lead to innovation in the maritime sector. It's an utterly bizarre idea without any kind of empirical foundation whatsoever, but it's extremely widespread. Extremely widespread, and to be completely bewildering, because I have no idea about what the process that's meant to... I mean, I understand what the process is, let's have a film industry. It's hard to do it, but at least I understand what someone's trying to do. I have no idea how you improve the overall performance of your economy by having what's called lots of creative people about. It just doesn't make any sense to me at all, but it's extremely popular and has to be resisted at all costs.
We're going to